Former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has died due to a form of cancer. He was 88 years old. Donald Rumsfeld is also one of the primary architects of the Iraq War, which led to over the deaths of 1 million people at the current present moment. And Rumsfeld himself was part of a very select core group of people who were considered the architects of not just the Iraq War, but Afghanistan, and later with their policies, Libya, Syria, and Pakistan. They would be called the Vulcans. Part of a neoconservative think tank, the Project for a New American Centuries, one of the primary declarees is also Donald Rumsfeld. But he had a long career, and we're going to jot down how he may have started with good intentions, but the longer you stay within politics, the longer you graduate to becoming the devil. After serving in the military, his career in government between the years 1962 to 1977 saw a multitude of positions. In 1957, during the Dwight D. Eisenhower administration, Rumsfeld served as the administrative assistant to David S. Dennison, a congressman representing the 11th District of Ohio. In 1959, he moved on to become a staff assistant to Congressman Robert P. Griffin of Michigan. And from 1960 to 62, Rumsfeld set his sights on becoming a member of Congress. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for Illinois' 13th Congressional District in 1962 at the age of 30, and he was reelected by large majorities in 1964, 66, and 68. During Rumsfeld's tenure as member of the House of Representatives, he voiced concerns about the U.S.'s ability in the Vietnam War, saying that President Johnson and his national security team was too overconfident with how the war was being constructed. On one occasion, Rumsfeld joined with other members of the House and traveled to Vietnam for a fact-finding mission to see for themselves how the war was going. The trip led to Rumsfeld believing that the South Vietnamese government was much too independent on the United States. Rumsfeld was also unsatisfied when he received a briefing about war planning from the commander of the U.S. troops in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland. The trip led Rumsfeld to co-sponsor a resolution to bring the conduct of the war to the House floor for further debate and discussion about the mismanagement, which ultimately decided the fate of the war. However, under constant pressure from the Johnson administration, Democrats who at the time held majority in the House of Representatives blocked the resolution from consideration. Rumsfeld resigned from Congress in 1969 to serve President Richard Nixon in his administration and served in a variety of executive branches throughout the Nixon presidency. In 1969, Nixon sought to reform and reorganize the United States Office of Economic Opportunity, an organization created during the Kennedy administration and greatly expanded as a part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Rather than eliminate it outright, he appointed Rumsfeld director of the organization with cabinet rank. Rumsfeld had voted against the creation of the OEO when he was in Congress and initially rejected Nixon's offer, citing his own inherent belief that the OEO did more harm than good, and he had felt he was not the right person for the job. He only accepted after personal pleas from Nixon. As director, Rumsfeld sought to reorganize the office to serve as a laboratory for experimental programs. Several beneficiary anti-poverty programs was saved by allocating funds to then from other less successful government programs. During this time, he hired Frank Carlucci and Dick Cheney to serve under him. Legendary writer Jack Anderson would write that, quote, anti-poverty czar Rumsfeld had cut programs to aid the poor while spending thousands to redecorate his office, end quote. He left the OEO in December of 1970. Nixon named Rumsfeld counselor to the president, a general advisory position. In his role, he retained cabinet status. In August 1974, after Nixon resigned as president in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, Rumsfeld was called back to Washington to serve as the transition chairman of Gerald Ford. He had been Ford's competent since their days in the White House before Ford and House Minority Leader. As the new president settled in, Ford appointed Rumsfeld White House Chief of Staff, where he served between 1974 and 1975. According to Bob Woodward's 2002 Bush at War, a rivalry developed between the two men. George Bush, who was then the director of the CIA, and of course, Gerald Ford. At the Pentagon, Rumsfeld oversaw the transition to all volunteer military. He sought to reverse the gradual decline in the defense budget and to build a U.S. strategic conventional forces, undermining Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at the SALT talks. He asserted, along with Team B, which was a competitive analysis exercise by the Central Intelligence Agency, that trends in comparative U.S.-Soviet military strength, he had not favored the United States for 15 to 20 years, and that if it continued, they would, quote, have the effect of injecting a fundamental instability in the world, end quote. For this reason, he oversaw the development of cruise missiles, the B-1 bomber, and a major naval shipbuilding program. In early 1977, Rumsfeld briefly lectured at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. His sights instead turned to business, and from 1978 to 1985, Rumsfeld served as chief executive officer, president, and then chairman of G.D. Sale and Company, a worldwide pharmaceutical company based in Skokie, Illinois. Rumsfeld was named Secretary of Defense soon after George Bush took office in 2001. Despite Rumsfeld's past rivalry with previous President Bush, Bush's first choice, FedEx founder Fred Smith, was unavailable. Vice President-elect Cheney recommended Rumsfeld for the job. Rumsfeld's second tenure as Secretary of Defense cemented him as the most powerful Pentagon chief since Robert McNamara and one of the most influential cabinet members in the Bush administration. His tenure proved to be pivotal and rocky, one that led the United States military into the disastrous 21st century. Following the September 11th attacks, Rumsfeld led the military planning and execution of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and the subsequent disaster called the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He pushed hard to send as small a force as possible to both conflicts, a conflict between Paul Wolfowitz himself, which codified the Rumsfeld Doctrine. The Rumsfeld Doctrine itself was named after, of course, Donald Rumsfeld, which was concerned with the perceived transformation and of the U.S. military. It would be considered Rumsfeld's own take on the resolution of military affairs. The basic tenets of this strategy are high technology combat systems, reliance on air forces, small, nimble ground forces. Throughout his time as Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld was noted for his candor and quick wit when giving weekly press conferences and speaking with the press. U.S. News and World Report called him, quote, a straight-talking Midwesterner, end quote. On the day of the September 11, 2001 attacks, actually the day before, Rumsfeld announced that the Department of Defense could not account for $2.3 trillion worth of transactions in the Pentagon. This conspiracy actually led to many fringe conspiracists to allege that because of the attack on the Pentagon on when American Airlines Flight 77 impacted the West Wall, it had impacted the wing where the Office of Naval Intelligence was investigating the issue. However, the issue was reported by the Associated Press in March of 2000. The money wasn't missing, it was simply not allocated properly within the Pentagon, but budgeting accounting offices. Within 3 hours of the attacks, started the first hijacking, and 2 hours after American Airlines struck the World Trade Center, North Tower, Rumsfeld raised the defense condition, signaling of the United States offensive readiness to DEFCON 3, the highest it had been since the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. Rumsfeld addressed the nation at a press conference at the Pentagon just 8 hours after the attacks and stated, quote, "It's an indication that the United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon is functioning. It will be in business tomorrow," end quote. However, it wasn't what he was doing during the day of 9/11. It was what came after 9/11. And just to quickly point out the irony of his position and the evilness of what took place, primarily because of Rumsfeld, we have to go back to 1983. On December 20th, 1983, it was Rumsfeld who visited Baghdad, where he met Saddam Hussein at Saddam's palace and had a 90-minute discussion. They largely agreed on opposing Syria's occupation of Lebanon, preventing Syrian and Iranian expansion, and preventing arms sales to Iran. Rumsfeld suggested that if U.S.-Iraq relations could improve, the U.S. might support a new oil pipeline across Jordan, in which Iraq had opposed but was now willing to reconsider. Rumsfeld also informed Iraqi Deputy Prime Minister and former Minister Tariq Aziz that, quote, "Our efforts to assist were inhibited by certain things that made it difficult for us, citing the use of chemical weapons," end quote. During the Iran-Iraq War of 1980, it was stated that the United States White House specifically knew that Iraq had been using chemical weapons, which directly against the Geneva Conventions. However, the United States did not report it. Rumsfeld wrote later in his memoir, Known and Unknown, that his meeting with Hussein had been the subject of gossip, rumors, and crackpot conspiracy theories for a quarter of a century. However, what is also known is that the United States assisted Iraq in their war against Iran. It was after the attacks of September 11th that Rumsfeld issued rapid orders to his aides to look for evidence of possible Iraqi involvement in regards to what had just occurred. According to notes taken by senior policy official Stephen Cambone, Cambone wrote that best information, judge whether good information hits Saddam Hussein. At the same time, not only UBL, meaning Osama bin Laden, Cambone's notes quoted Rumsfeld as saying, quote, "Need to move swiftly. Near term, target needs, go massive, sweep it all up, things related and not," end quote. In the first emergency meeting of the National Security Council on the day of the attacks, Rumsfeld asked, quote, "Why shouldn't we go against Iraq? Not just Al-Qaeda," end quote. With his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, adding that Iraq was a, quote, "brittle, oppressive regime that might break easily. It was doable," end quote. And according to John Camper, who's a British author, broadcaster, and commentator, from that moment on, he and Wolfowitz used every available opportunity to press the case for a war against Iraq. The idea was initially rejected at the behest of Secretary of State Colin Powell, but according to Camper, quote, "Undeterred, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz held secret meetings about opening up a second front against Saddam. Powell was excluded," end quote. In such meetings, they created a policy that would later be dubbed the Bush Doctrine, which was basically an extension of the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine refers to multiple interrelated foreign policy principles, and these principles included unilateralism and the use of preemptive war, attacking countries also that harbored terrorists. But the term terrorists was led up to the interpretation of the definition behind it to the White House. On September 20th, 2001, President made an even more aggressive reinstatement to the principle of the attacks, where he said, quote, "We will pursue nations that provide aid or safe haven to terrorism. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. From this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime, end quote. In such meetings, they created a policy that would be dubbed the Bush Doctrine, centering on pre-exemption in the war in Iraq, which the members of the Project of the New American Century had advocated in their earlier letters. The Project for the New American Century was a neoconservative think tank based in Washington, D.C., that focused on the United States foreign policy. Of the 25 original signees, 10 went on to serve in the administration of George Bush, including Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Richard Perle, and Donald Rumsfeld. The directors were Robert Kagan, John Bolton, Bruce Jackson, and Devon Cross, all who would be hardline neoconservative. The Project for the New American Century developed from Christopher Kagan's belief that the Republican Party lacked a compelling vision for American foreign policy, which would allow Republican leaders to effectively criticize Bill Clinton's foreign policy record. During the summer of 1996, it was Christopher Kagan who co-authored an article in Foreign Affairs, which was an American magazine by the Council on Foreign Relations, titled "Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy," referring to the foreign policy of President Reagan. In the article, they argued that American conservatives were adrift in the area of foreign policy, advocated a more elevated vision of America's international role, and suggested that the United States should adopt a stance on benevolent global hegemony. PNAC's first act was to release a statement of principles on June 3rd of 1997, in which the statement had 25 signers, including project members, outside supporters, and members of the neoconservative movement. It described the United States as the preeminent world power and said that the nation faced a challenge to shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests. It said that the United States should strengthen ties with its democratic allies that advocated for regime change in certain countries, quote, challenge regimes hostile to our interests and values, and preserve and extend to international order friendly to our security and prosperity and our principles, end quote. In September of 2000, PNAC released Rebuilding America's Defenses, a report that promotes the belief that America should seek to preserve and extend its portion of global leadership by maintaining the preeminence of U.S. military forces. The report also stated, quote, advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool, end quote. In 1998, Christopher Kagan advocated regime change in Iraq throughout the Iraq disarmament process. Though articles that were published in the New York Times, articles that were published in the New York Times, following perceived Iraqi unwillingness to cooperate with UN weapons inspections, core members of the PNAC, including Perle, James Woolsey, Elliot Abrams, Donald Rumsfeld, and John Bolton, were among the signatories of an open letter initiated by PNAC to President Bill Clinton calling for the forced removal of Saddam Hussein, in which, believing that UN sanctions against Iraq would be ineffective means of disarming Iraq, PNAC members also wrote to a letter to the Republican member of the U.S. Congress, Newt Gingrich and Trent Luft, urging Congress to act and support the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998, which President Clinton signed into law in October of '88. In January of '99, PNAC circulated a memo that criticized the December 1998 bombing of Iraq in Operation Desert Fox as ineffective. It would be the Project of the New American Century that would be the influence for certain members of the Bush administration, specifically Donald Rumsfeld. And now we go back to 2001, which all of this would make sense as to why Donald Rumsfeld basically should be held accountable for what came after the Iraq War, in which uh, Richard Clark, the White House counterterrorism coordinator at the time, in 2001, revealed details of another National Security Council meeting the day after the attacks, during which officials considered the U.S. response against Iraq. Two of those officials who pressured Clark and the FBI to find Iraqi complicity in the September 11th attacks, in which Mueller stated that would be impossible. Bush then pressured CIA Director George Tenet to find and, quote, find me a way to link 9/11 to Iraq, end quote. Already, Clark said there were certain Al Qaeda ways to blame, and there was no hint of Iraqi involvement. Clark would later quote, Rumsfeld was saying we needed to bomb Iraq, in which Clark then stated, we all said, no, Al Qaeda is in Afghanistan, end quote. Clark also revealed that Rumsfeld complained in the meeting, quote, there aren't any good targets in Afghanistan, and there are lots of good targets in Iraq, end quote. Rumsfeld also wrote in his Known and Unknown book that, quote, much has been written about the Bush administration's focus on Iraq after 9/11. Commentators have suggested that it was strange or obsessive for the president and his advisors to have raised questions about whether Saddam Hussein was somehow behind the terrorist attacks of September 11th. I have never understood the controversy. I had no idea if Iraq was or was not involved. But it would have been irresponsible for any administration not to have asked the question, end quote. A memo written by Rumsfeld dated November 27, 2001, considers an Iraq war. One section of the memo questions how to start, listing multiple possible justifications for the U.S. Iraq war, in which an excerpt for the memo, quote, Saddam moves against Kurds to north, U.S. discovers Saddam's connection to September 11th attack, anthrax attacks, dispute over WMB inspections, end quote. Rumsfeld directed the planning for the war in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks on September 21st, 2001. U.S. CENTCOM Commander General Tommy Franks briefed the president on a plan to destroy Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and remove the Taliban government. Franks also initially proposed Rumsfeld that the U.S. invade Afghanistan using a conventional force of 80,000 troops, preceded by 6 months of preparation. Rumsfeld, however, feared that a conventional invasion of Afghanistan could bog down as to what happened to the Soviets in 1979. Rumsfeld rejected Franks' plan, saying, quote, I want men on the ground now. Franks returned the next day with a plan utilizing U.S. Special Forces. Before and during the Iraq War, Rumsfeld claimed that Iraq had an active weapons of mass destruction program. In particular, during his famous phase, there are known and unknowns, and there are known knowns, in a press conference at the Pentagon on February 12th of 2002. However, no stockpiles were ever found. Bush administration officials also claimed there was an operational relationship between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. A Pentagon Inspector General report found that Rumsfeld's top policy aide, Douglas Feith, who was part of AIPAC, quote, developed, produced, and then disseminated alternative intelligence assessments on the Iraq and Al Qaeda relationship, which included some conclusions that were inconsistent with the consensus of the intelligence community to senior decision makers, end quote. The job of finding WMDs and providing justification for the attack fell to the intelligence services, but according to Camphor, quote, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz believed that while the established security services had a role, they were too bureaucratic and too traditional in their thinking, end quote. As a result, they set up what they came to be known as the cabal, a cell of 8 or 9 analysts in the Office of Special Plans, which was basically uh, a unit of the Pentagon created by Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, which had a special room for only keys that were given to members of this group and not to other members of the White House. According to an unnamed Pentagon source quoted by Seymour Hersh, the Office of Special Plans was created in order to find evidence of what Wolfowitz and his boss, Secretary Rumsfeld, believed to be true, that Saddam Hussein had close ties to Al Qaeda and that Iraq had an enormous arsenal of chemical, biological, and possible even nuclear weapons that threatened the region and potentially the United States. However, all of this would turn out to be untrue. The evidence that would supported the Iraq war were fabricated. Evidence that came from torture of Sheikh Ibn al-Libi, who told the CIA captors that he witnessed members of the Ba'athist Army in Iraq and members of al-Qaeda facilitating chemical weapons. That information turned out to be untrue. Later, the CIA would facilitate information from Israeli intelligence suggesting that Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the September 11th attacks, had met with Ba'athist leaders in Prague regarding chemical weapons. This also would turn out to be untrue. However, that information, as well as Sheikh Ibn al-Libi's information, coerced through torture, was used as a pretext for the war of Iraq that was elucidated through the infamous briefing led by Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations Security Council in 2002. The torture and prison abuse of Abu Ghraib would also haunt Donald Rumsfeld, in which the Department of Defense preliminary concerns for holding, housing, and interrogating captured prisoners on the battlefield that raised issues during the military buildup to the Iraq War. Rumsfeld himself would quote, "These events occurred on my watch as Secretary of Defense. I am accountable for them," end quote. He offered his resignation to President Bush in the wake of the scandal, but it was not accepted. In a memo read by Rumsfeld detailing how Guantanamo interrogators induce stress positions, quote, "I stand for 8 to 10 hours a day, while you're standing by prisoners limited to 4 hours," end quote. Rumsfeld also authored much of the torture programs. In 2005, the ACLU and Human Rights first filed a lawsuit against Rumsfeld and other top government officials on behalf of 8 men who they say were subjugated to torture and abuse by U.S. forces under the command of Secretary Rumsfeld. In 2005, a suit was filed against Rumsfeld by several human rights organizations for allegedly violating U.S. and international law that prohibited torture and cruel, inhumane, or degrading punishment. Also in 2005, German prosecutor Wolfgang Kalleck filed a criminal complaint charging Rumsfeld and 11 other U.S. officials as war criminals who either ordered to torture prisoners or drafted laws that legitimated its use. The charges based on breaches of the UN Convention Against Torture and the German Code of Crimes Against International Law. It probably would have worked, but the United States is not part of the International Criminal Courts, which are also known as the Rome Statutes, in which their crimes would have been held accountable, and members of the PNAC and members of the White House under the Bush administration would be held for crimes against humanity, which would have been held at The Hague had they been co-signers of the International Criminal Courts. I could easily sit here and demean Donald Rumsfeld, and I will. It's a moral issue, it's a human issue, and we should speak out on these demagogues and sociopaths that represent us by name. When they say the United States, we're involved. So when Rumsfeld died of multiple myeloma, which is basically cancer of the plasma cells, I think that he got a quiet way out. Even though cancer is not something to sniff at, but Rumsfeld, if he had been burned at the stake, wouldn't have garnered any sympathy. Because after the Iraq War, which led to the deaths of over 1 million people approximately, the deaths of 38,000 people in Afghanistan, approximately, and God knows how many people have been killed in the drone strikes that precipitated after the Bush administration, especially under the Obama administration, but simply the Obama administration is just the extension of the Bush administration and its policies, which were authorized by the neoconservative faction, which were basically a faction called the Vulcans, and the PNAC signatories. God knows how many people were killed, the hundreds of thousands that are continually killed in Libya, Syria, Pakistan, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran, the Sudan, and the continued oppression of these Islamic peoples with the fraudulent war on terror, all because Donald Rumsfeld and people like Rumsfeld in high positions of government are given a leeway, an allowance, because the American people stood by silently. And even though they protested later, there was a huge protest to the Iraq War. It wasn't enough. We need to hold these people accountable and condemn the likes of people like Donald Rumsfeld and make it known throughout the course of time that people who are similar to Donald Rumsfeld should never be tolerated, not just by the international community, more importantly, by us, the American people.